B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Thursday, March 8th, 2018. Do you follow me on Twitter? Well, I pity the fools. There's a new study that shows there's a lot of bullshit on Twitter, and it's not being promoted by Russian bots. Now, let me freely acknowledge that I'm a little bit on the older side of the technology curve, and I know a lot of people who thrive on Twitter. They love the give and take, the back and forth, the name-calling, the one-upsmanship. I don't really gravitate to Twitter. And every day when I post a new podcast, I do tweet about that. And many people retweet that, and I'm grateful for it. But I don't just dive into Twitter. I don't follow Trump. I follow a couple of dozen people. And about twice a week, I go there and see what's been happening. So I am not any advocate of Twitter. Now you know my bias. So there's a new MIT study, and they looked at a lot of tweets. They looked at 4.5 million tweets, 3 million users, and 126,000 stories that were shared over a 9-year period on Twitter. So this is not isolated to the 2016 cycle. This really goes to the history of Twitter. I think it's about 9 years old. And what the researchers did was they decided what was true and what was false by using 6 independent fact-checking organizations, and they're not perfect: Snopes, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, TruthOrFiction.com, HoaxSlayer.com, and Urban Legends. But let's just assume that those are fair arbiters of what is accurate and what is not. Well, there's an old saying, and I can't remember who first said this, but it was something to the effect that a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth gets his pants on to do something about it. And what we are learning is that on Twitter, false information travels much faster and reaches many more people than true information. It takes the truth about 6 times as long to get its pants on. About 6 times as long as false information to reach 1,500 people on Twitter, based on the estimates of these researchers. And even then, truthful stories rarely spread to more than 1,000 people, while clicky false stories can reach up to 100,000 people. Yeah, that's a factor of 100x. Falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth. Falsehood diffused significantly farther, faster, deeper. That's like a Kanye West song. And more broadly than the truth in all categories of information. The study's lead author, Soroush Vosugi, said the most surprising finding was how clearly we could see the difference between how false and true news spreads. I didn't realize it was going to be so clear and prominent. And they found that automated bots have played a minimal role. False news spreads more than the truth because humans, not robots, are more likely to spread it. And many of those humans know that what they're sharing is sketchy. Some of it confirms their own bias. Some of it, they are tweaking somebody with a different point of view, and they find it entertaining. And this is just useful fodder. The veracity of it doesn't matter to them. And so I think this is very interesting, and it tends to confirm my pre-existing bias. I just don't go to Twitter looking to be informed or educated. I expect insults. And that's why it's Trump's favorite platform, which is, by the way, the subject of a lawsuit in a federal court trial that opens in New York today. It is considering whether President Trump has the right to block certain individuals from interacting with him on Twitter simply because they've said things about him that he does not like. And they offer an example of the tweet cycle. The president tweets something significant, like the transgender military ban. This information appears instantaneously to his roughly 40 million Twitter followers. Millions of these people, supporters and opponents, begin to write their own reactions at internet speed. His 40 million followers can see their reactions and in turn react to them. Other Twitter users can react to the reactions to the reactions. The news media reports the original news and often attempts to summarize the reaction that they're seeing, and then Twitter users react to the news of their reaction. And so this is a spiral, it's a cycle that feeds on itself. So the act being challenged is whether the president has the right to block a Twitter user from following his account. And it relates to whether this is an official communication from the President of the United States or just Fat Donald sitting on his porcelain throne and purging his system, so to speak. So I think it's an interesting case. And I would argue that Trump's communications, since he was inaugurated, are official statements of the president, and whether it's the First Amendment or just basic fairness, he should not have the right to block somebody from following his tweets and reacting to them. And the other factor here is that by blocking users, those users don't know that Trump has issued a new tweet. So I'm happy to let the courts sort this one out. Meanwhile, there's an interesting piece yesterday in the New York Times under the bylines of Michael Grinbaum and John Herman. It was reprinted in the San Francisco Chronicle today under the headline, Google and Facebook Becoming Foils for the Right. And it tells us that Peter Schweitzer, the guy who wrote the hit book about the Clinton Foundation, it did have some accurate information in it, but it was also a political hit piece. He is working on a film that should debut in May at the Cannes Film Festival, and it's called The Creepy Line. The title alludes to an infamous speech in 2010 by Eric Schmidt, chief executive of Google at the time, who dismissed concerns about privacy by declaring that his company's policy was to get right up to the creepy line, but not cross it. And this article airs out the complaints of conservatives from Breitbart to James O'Keefe, the so-called filmmaker, so-called truth seeker. And, you know, they may have a case that they feel that they're not being properly treated by these big media giants. But in what appears to be an 1,100-word story, there is no reference to the efforts that have been undertaken by Google and to some extent by Facebook to edit out sites like peterbcollins.com, like consortiumnews.com, TruthDig, TruthOut, World Socialist website. We know that traffic to these lefty independent media outlets has been sharply reduced by search engine algorithms at Google, and we suspect that similar things have happened with Facebook. So I find it fascinating that the New York Times could spill this much ink and not even make a passing reference to this side of the coin. So as of 3:30 Eastern Time today, Trump has the war that he has been itching for. It doesn't involve the Pentagon, but he's got extra money over there if he wants to start one of those wars. No, Trump is launching his trade war. It's dividing the Republican Party, which is not an altogether bad thing, but it is based on Trump's instincts and his belief in his stable genius. And today, to try to mollify critics, including 100 Republicans who sent him a letter saying, "What?" Trump said, "Don't worry. I'm going to be flexible on how these tariffs are managed. And we'll put them on, we'll take them off, we'll let people in, we'll let people out." And that is precisely what is wrong with Trump's action. As I've told you before, I am not a free trader. And I believe that intelligent use of tariffs and duties can be helpful to our economy. It could protect certain jobs, although I think most of those jobs have already gone offshore and they are not coming back. And Trump lies about the source of some of our economic problems. He tweeted, as he loves to, "From Bush 1 to the present, our country has lost more than 55,000 factories, 6 million manufacturing jobs, and accumulated trade deficits of more than $12 trillion. Well, we know that the 6 million jobs were not all lost to lower-cost workers in other parts of the world. Automation, robots, and other changes in the workplace have reduced the number of jobs available to Americans in many respects that don't have anything to do with trade deficits or international trade rules. And by promising, he said, we're going to be very flexible." At a morning cabinet meeting? Well, flexible means arbitrary. And so how does Canada know what our intentions are when we say the real culprit on the steel tariff that we're going after is China? But China ranks 11th in steel exports to the United States. Let me say that more accurately. They rank 11th among steel imports by the United States. So we're going to punish 10 other countries in an effort to teach a lesson to China. So Trump has indicated his tariff order would be tailored to exclude some countries, would give him the authority to raise or lower levies on a country-by-country basis, and to add or take countries off the list as he deems fit. What? So he really believes he's some sort of an emperor, and he can issue a royal decree, and then he can change it the next day? And this is not a tenable approach to trying to regulate trade. It is this ad hoc, emotional, and often irrational approach based on Trump's own information, some of which we know is exaggerated, if not flatly false. So 100 Republican lawmakers sent this letter to Trump, begging him to drop plans for the tariffs. We urge you to reconsider the idea of broad tariffs to avoid unintended negative consequences. And the Republicans, I heard Paul Ryan in one soundbite, he used the phrase surgical, the kind of tariffs he can support, like 11 times in a 30-second comment. So that's the talking point of the Republicans. But last night on the PBS NewsHour, they profiled an American company led by a guy who is clearly a Trump sympathizer. They make beer kegs out of steel. Currently, they're making them out of American steel. But he noted that his cost of materials will go up if the 25% tariff on steel is imposed on steel imports. He can't get the steel he needs domestically. It's not made anymore. Not here in the U.S. of A. And he said while the tariffs will impact the cost of his raw materials, they will not impact the cost of finished goods. Beer kegs made in China and shipped as a finished product into the United States. And that's just one example of how this is no coherent approach to the very complex issues of international trade. But Trump's a stable genius, and of course, it's pretty clear that while he has some business smarts and he can add and subtract dollars, that he has no interest in and no patience for the details and the complexities that I just referred to. And here's the kind of thing that you're going to hear Trump tweeting about if he hasn't already. Outside St. Louis, just across the river in Illinois, is a town called Granite City that features a plant, a belching smokestack or complex of smokestacks called Granite City. Owned by U.S. Steel, the company has announced that it will put 500 workers back on the job by restarting one of the 2 idled blast furnaces at Granite City. And the St. Louis Post-Dispatch goes through quite a bit of detail about the ups and downs of the plant, and that, 1,500 workers lost their jobs back in 2015 and 2016. But when you get toward the end of the article, they acknowledge that U.S. Steel was going to rehire some, if not all, of these 500 people anyway. So they opportunistically kiss the president's ass by claiming that they're doing it because of the incentives of Trump's tariff proposals. And meanwhile, I have mixed feelings about this. All of the countries that were negotiating with the U.S. in secret during the Obama administration over the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of those countries except the United States yesterday signed a deal in Santiago, Chile. It's 11 nations, including Japan, Canada, Australia. I'll name the others in a moment. And they have made deals. For example, Australia can sell beef into Japan without duty, while the United States beef exporters face tariffs of 38.5%. Now, this is one of the issues that the TPP was supposed to address, that Japan's markets are not open. We don't sell many automobiles in Japan. They sell boatloads here in the United States. And not all of them are imported, as you know. The Japanese car makers and the Germans all have assembly plants in the United States these days. So, with that in mind, it galls me to hear Japan's foreign minister saying only free trade will contribute to inclusive growth of the world economy. Protectionism isn't a solution. Well, Japan is one of the most highly protectionist economies in that part of the world, and they were the main target of our good intentions, such as they were, around the TPP. So the other member nations include Mexico, Vietnam, New Zealand, Chile, Malaysia, Peru, Singapore, and Brunei. And we'll see how their deal goes. They have invited the U.S. to participate. And if it didn't include all the ancillary chapters, if you remember, the TPP totaled almost 28 chapters, and only about 5 of them related to trade and those direct issues. It also unraveled labor, environmental regulation, and other critical aspects of the U.S. Regulatory framework. Trump is an idiot, as we know, and it's pretty clear that Special Counsel Mueller is working on cases of obstruction of justice against Trump and some of his appointees. So that raises eyebrows as the New York Times reports last night that Trump has talked to 2 of his former appointees, one former, one present, who have been interviewed by the investigators for Mueller's special counsel office. One is the White House counsel, Don McGahn, and this is one of the episodes where Trump really crossed a line, and it has to make his lawyers just go ballistic. So he told an aide that the White House counsel McGahn should issue a statement denying a New York Times article published this past January. That article said McGahn had told investigators the president once asked him to fire Bob Mueller. McGahn never released a statement, later had to remind the president that the president had indeed asked McGahn to see that Mr. Mueller was dismissed. And the other episode is where Trump asked his former chief of staff, Reince Priebus, how his interview had gone with the special counsel's investigators and whether they had been nice. Now, Priebus says he didn't cough up any information about the content of his interview, but this kind of tampering is really, really dangerous. And it underscores for me that Trump has dug his own grave. Whether Russia did any meddling in the election in 2016, to me, is largely irrelevant. Since he took office, Trump has been running a cover-up. The firing of James Comey, who, by the way, is going to do a national book tour in April, and we're going to have to revisit all this stuff again, and St. Jim will be lionized by so many people. But there's some interesting commentary at the Washington Post about this by Aaron Blake, who notes Trump's response to a story about him possibly obstructing the investigation by trying to fire Mueller was to try to do something else that might be construed as obstruction, manufacturing a false denial. He also says Trump's response to the story about McGahn possibly quitting over Trump's effort to fire Mueller, was to threaten to fire McGahn? As he points out, that's not very logical. But then, that's our boy, Donald. And one more from the Trump file today. This is so bizarre, because Trump, through his spokesperson, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and it's so hard not to make fun of her. She is such a flaming asshole. But she, with a straight face, or as straight as her face gets, yesterday, said that the president's made very clear that the allegations by porn actress Stormy Daniels, that none of these allegations are true. Yet she confirmed that one of the president's lawyers, Michael Cohen, obtained a victory in an arbitration case requiring said Stormy Daniels to keep her mouth shut, to enforce the hush money deal reached with Daniels in the final days of the 2016 campaign. Now, Daniels has sued Trump in court, saying that she doesn't have to honor the hush money agreement because Trump never signed it. I have no idea if that is a reasonable legal issue. But Mike Cohen, he arranged for an arbitrator in Los Angeles, a retired state judge named Jacqueline Connor, to issue what is a really bizarre restraining order, a temporary restraining order to muzzle Daniels. Now, I don't understand how an arbitrator can order that unless the language of this hush money agreement, and it appears that Daniels took the $130,000, which would, to me, indicate that the agreement was in effect. They offered a deal. Based on her accepting money, she accepted the money. They have a deal. I don't think Trump signing it is really relevant, but again, I am not privileged to see any of these documents, and so I can only speculate like everyone else does. But let's just refocus this. The White House is saying that they have won an arbitration case requiring Stormy Daniels not to publicly claim she had an affair with Trump. And they think that's a victory? And the religious right sits still for this bullshit? These are strange times. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Let's look at the list here. Julie Anders just renewed her annual subscription. Mona Kobus, Anna Gordonier, Brian Mazzy, they're all monthly subscribers. They kick in $5. Could you do that? Well, if you're nodding your head, don't stop now. Pause the podcast, come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. When you get to the sign-up page, choose the level of support that's comfortable for you, and you will have my enduring gratitude. I linked to a great story at Shadowproof about how the police targeted, ahead of the Charlottesville showdown last year, not the white supremacists who were converging from across the nation, nominally to object to the removal of Confederate statues, but by getting Freedom of Information Act releases. Will Parrish has written a story that shows that the FBI was much more concerned about the anti-racist protesters, who they always referred to as anarchist extremists and black identity terrorists, or black identity extremists. Now, that's not even remotely connected to the reality of what occurred there. And the article also exposes that here in California, the FBI and the Fusion Center run by the Joint Terrorism Task Force has singled out the nonviolent protesters of the fascists and the white supremacists and the racists. And so this is a very scary development. And tomorrow or on Monday, Who, What, Why will post my latest podcast with A.C. Thompson, a reporter who's exposed a national homegrown white supremacist racist group called Atomwaffen. And you'll learn more about that when I share an excerpt from that as soon as the podcast is posted. We've been following the actions of the U.S. Senate as a group of Democrats, as many as 15, appear to be poised to join Republicans in supporting the Crapo Bill. I like to mispronounce it as Crapo because that's what it is. It, of course, undermines the regulations of Dodd-Frank. It benefits big banks that are making record profits. It allows them to grow even bigger and to threaten our economy in the future. And David Dayen's doing a great job reporting on this at The Intercept. He notes that the bill keeps changing and that they may jam in as many as 40 additional amendments before the senators are asked to vote on it as early as tomorrow, Friday. And that means they will not have read the bill. They won't know what's in it. And according to Dayen, who has compared the shifting version with the original, the key elements that benefit big banks haven't changed a bit. Oh, there is some language to create parity for foreign banks operating in the United States. And there's just a lot of sleight of hand going on here. And it appears that in the interest of bipartisanship and access to corporate campaign contributions, we're going to see a vote that passes this in the very near future. My senior senator here in California, Dianne Feinstein, recognizes that she is underwater with the voters. Her reelect numbers at about 45%. She didn't get the state party endorsement. She's being challenged from her left by State Senator Kevin De Leon. And she is still regretting a comment she made in San Francisco in August at a public forum, where she kind of suggested that Trump, could be worked with and he could become a good president. Well, she's learned a lesson from that, and she took to Twitter yesterday to demand the resignation of Scott Lloyd, the Trump administration official who has been blocking abortion access for immigrants who are held by our government in deportation lockups and similar facilities. Yesterday, I told you how the Democrats running House challengers this year have recruited 25% of the challenger candidates come from the military intelligence communities. And so in order to elect these soldiers and spooks, the Democratic Super PAC has announced that it has reserved $43 million of TV time to promote their candidates in the midterm elections. Only problem is they only have $11 million in the bank. The power of young people. Here on the West Coast in San Francisco, the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals has allowed a lawsuit brought by 21 young people from the state of Oregon, ranging in age from 10 to 21. They are claiming that the government's failure to respond to climate change is endangering their future, the planet, and just about everything. And while the Ninth Circuit did not delve into the merits of the lawsuit, they rejected government demands that the suit be dismissed. And the youth power in Florida has produced something. You know how after the Parkland shooting, people said, well, they've got to do something. Well, the legislature has done something. And the historic part is that after 20 years of passing not a single gun regulation bill, only deregulation bills, the legislature yesterday cobbled together a couple of pieces and put it into a bill that they passed. But it's got some stinky parts to it. It does raise the age required of someone to buy most guns in Florida to 21. But it also will include a program to arm some teachers in response to the shooting that left 7 people dead. Now, the wild card here is Governor Rick Scott, a Republican, who has yet to announce but is expected to announce he's running for the U.S. Senate this fall. And he is a Republican who is really on the hot seat here. He does oppose arming teachers, and I certainly agree with Rick Scott about that. But will he refuse to sign this bill with the imprimatur of these students? And do the students really support arming teachers in the schools, or do they just want to see some action, any kind of action? I'm not sure. Also, relative to one of the big mass shootings in Florida in recent years, the Pulse Nightclub in Orlando, Glenn Greenwald with Murtaza Hussein at The Intercept published a piece a couple of days ago, and I finally got through it, where they make a case that the shooter, Omar Mateen, has not been proven to be gay or have any gay behavior tendencies, and that some of the reporting that occurred after the shooting was false. Now, I've read this entire article, and I appreciate the effort that Greenwald and Hussein put into this. But I'm not terribly persuaded, because the article is circumspect in many ways. It really just attacks the idea that Omar Mateen was on a bender against LGBTQ persons, and that he selected the Pulse nightclub to achieve that goal. But while Greenwald does mention the real-time reporting from eyewitnesses that Mateen had been a patron of the Pulse, that he was a guy who was a Muslim conflicted by an emerging gay identity, well, the article makes the case that Mateen didn't select the Pulse nightclub until the last minute. He was driving away to a place called Eve when he decided to come back to the Pulse. Now, a lot of this is based on the government's surveillance monitoring, but there's no mention of Mateen's past encounters, his conflict with the deputy sheriffs at the Port St. Lucie courthouse, where he worked as a private security guard. That was one of the triggering elements, I believe, of Mateen's behavior. So I've linked to it, and I encourage you to read it. You can make up your own minds, but I don't find it terribly persuasive. Yesterday, Jeffrey Beauregard, Jim Crow Sessions III, came out to California and staged a news conference in Sacramento, brandishing his lawsuit against the sanctuary laws that California has passed. He likened California's decision to defy the federal government's crackdown on undocumented immigrants to acts of defiance by slave-owning Southerners against the federal government in the mid-19th century that led to the Civil War. He rather oddly compared sanctuary city laws in California to attempts by slaveholding states to nullify federal laws, and blasted state officials for their radical open borders agenda. There is no nullification, there is no secession, Sessions declared. Well, I'm sometimes critical of our junior senator, Kamala Harris, but she got it right about Sessions. She blasted his Civil War rhetoric, said he has no credibility to comment on anything having to do with America's sordid racial legacy. As far as I'm concerned, said Harris, Jeff Sessions should be advised, and I'll advise him right now, that it's a bad idea for him to start talking about anything to do with the history of slavery or Reconstruction or the Civil War. His credibility is pretty much shot on those issues. And in his speech, Sessions attacked the mayor of Oakland, Libby Schaaf, who had issued a warning that ICE was about to conduct big sweeping raids. And he said, how dare you? He actually bungled the line when he said it. How dare you needlessly endanger the lives of law enforcement just to promote a radical open borders agenda? Now, there is no evidence, not a single scrap of evidence, that any law enforcement officer was put at risk by Schaaf's warning to undocumented persons. So she responded and lifted his how dare you. She said, how dare you vilify members of our community by trying to frighten the American public into thinking all undocumented residents are dangerous criminals. How dare you distort the reality about declining violent crime in a diverse sanctuary city like Oakland to advance your racist agenda. Right on, Libby Schaaf. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. We put it up on YouTube, where you can click subscribe there. You don't have to pay anything, but I would appreciate it if you do. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling